Hi guys, thanks for being with us today. My name is Brett Lyle. I am privileged to be with my guest today, David Patterson, who is CEO of Falck Rocky Mountain. David, thanks for being with us today.
You bet, Brett. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I want to talk to you a little bit about your journey through leadership, David, and the intention of my podcast is really just talk about shared experiences and some of the challenges and struggles that you faced and how you got through them. And so really offering people kind of a blueprint through the leadership and shared experiences. So if you would kind of share with us, you're in a CEO position of a global organization. How did you get to where you are, David? Kind of walk through us through your path, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Brett. I mean, not to bore your audience, but I think I had a path that was like many others in this field. I started out volunteering in EMS and then with the fire department. Then they had a paid role, did that, decided EMS was really something I had a passion for. So really went to work for Rural Metro in Texas, where I was doing the fire and volunteer EMS service where I came from initially. And then moved from the Houston area to during my university time and undergrad. I was a student EMS group and got a job with working on the ambulance in Rural Metro, who was doing the 911 service in Waco, where I was living, and then moved to Fort Worth and had the chance to work for a couple of years in the MedStar system, and then moved to Colorado about 20 years ago for the role I had with Rural Metro leading their Colorado market, and then transitioned to Falck in 2013. So really starting in the field as a line EMT and a paramedic, and then took on the role of supervisor and field instructor, and then took on the role of ops director, and then I'm general manager, and into the role I have today.
Yeah, so it sounds like a really kind of traditional path, but it got you to a very atypical, not so traditional place. So you're currently working for Falck, who, if I'm saying this correctly, entered the market in the U.S. in, was it 2012? About
2010. I mean, they had some operations in the safety side of the house, but the EMS or ambulance side really got started about 2010. Of course, they'd been globally as a company since 1906 and a number of countries in Copenhagen, where the headquarters for the global operation still is.
Sure. So share with our audience, because I'm sure a lot of people that are listening maybe have some global experiences, but in EMS and pre-hospital, even in hospital, our country is we operate in a silo from a healthcare perspective, and we do things the American way, right? And so what has that experience been like for you, having gone from, I'll call it a culture shift, even from Texas to Colorado, through that cultural experience, from being at Baylor and Waco. I think you went to school in Baylor, right?
Right.
So being in that culture that you knew, do you mind sharing with me and with our audience a little bit about kind of that transition to cultures that you know? How did you manage this intercultural transitions, or have you?
Well, it's a great question. Like I said, and like you pointed out, being a Texan originally, now I'm in Colorado for 20 years, but I think, sometimes we're, as you, right, Brett, you always claim Texas as a native. Working for Rural Metro was primarily a domestic EMS company, and so it was interesting to leverage some of the best practices and skills done around the U.S. And we know, the U.S. alone is very diverse in terms of its EMS applications and the way we do things. But you're right. Moving over to Falck was really interesting because the shift in terms of how culturally things are, how there's best practices that are not even in the consideration of the paradigm of what we do domestically in terms of how EMS is delivered internationally, was really interesting. And I think to learn about how different countries, different regions globally deliver EMS care is really eye-opening. I mean, I like to say, again, as a native Texan, we think certainly everything in Texas is the best. In some cases it is. And then there's other places we're very proud of what we do. But I think it's important, what I personally, the journey I had, was to really understand that, there are other ways of doing things, and not only on that journey, what we do throughout our own country, as I mentioned earlier, but internationally, it really is interesting. And I think we have to recognize the exceptionalism we have, but we also have to be open to understanding some of the ways that EMS is delivered and some of the processes and techniques. And maybe it's clinical, maybe it's technology, maybe it's interact with our teams. I mean, there's a number of different aspects of how other cultures lead organizations, as well as how they deliver EMS service.
Sure. I appreciate that. I think, one of the things, I don't know if everybody knows this about me, but my college education was communication. And so intercultural communication, organizational communication, all of those things have a different role, a different value, different skill sets. And navigating culture, I think important to kind of align definitions. And so when I say culture, it doesn't necessarily mean a state you're from, a country you're from. We're all part of a lot of cultures. And so the cultures that I'm in as a Texan, that's a culture. Culture I'm in as an Aggie is a culture. We're all parts of these subsets of people. And so I think what I find the most fascinating about navigating other people and the interpersonal communication is really finding those aligned, similar cultures that you're a part of, those kind of micro cultures that we're each made up of, to really get that understanding and to develop that. Have you found anything in particular, working with leadership that's, across the pond, time zone stuff and language stuff, and, just from the true culture of a European organization versus an American. Can you share some of this experience? I think you had the opportunity to go to a conference a few years ago internationally. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And, a number of those, you mentioned time zone. I mean, there's factors like that where a lot of those sorts of calls are super early in the morning in the US, it's at the afternoon overseas. Of course, Falc's in a number of different countries besides Denmark or Scandinavia, but that's typically where a lot of that comes into play. In 2017, you mentioned the EMS Congress or EMS conference, the European EMS conference that occurred, and they have an annual conference there. And I probably never would have thought about attending a conference there. I mean, we had certainly a lot of U.S. folks, not just from Falc, but A.J. Heidman from GEMS attended, and I think attends. Some other folks from leadership in the U.S. EMS market. But in this particular case, they had their EMS contest or game similar to how some of the conferences are done here in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So we had a team here in Aurora, Colorado for Falc attend and compete for some of the EMS that produce medical or trauma scenarios, and these teams from around the world, really, not just from Falc, but from other countries participated. And we teamed up and practiced a little bit with some of our Falc colleagues from Spain and our Falc colleagues from Denmark who are also in this contest. And, mm-hmm. Some of our providers were staffing RNs not as a critical care module, but as how they staff their daily 911 units. Right. Another had a physician, and that's just how they staff their 911 response model. So, just right away, you're saying, hey, our paramedics are competing, and they did well. We didn't win. Falc actually did take the prize in 2017 at this conference, but it was really neat to talk to colleagues, not just in leadership roles, but also some of these field provider roles who are delivering care. And what's interesting too is we've talked a little bit about the differences, Brett, but some of the challenges we face as EMS responders around the world, some of them are very similar actually. So mm-hmm. that was one of the more fascinating things, is not only the differences, but the similarities.
Sure. And so of those, and that's an incredible experience. I think really cool that you had an opportunity professionally to go to Europe. I mean, I have to say I'm a little jealous, but it sounds like a fun experience, and you obviously learn and you network and you grow. And so I'm always interested in, David, what did was there anything in particular that you brought back? You said, man, this is a cool thing and I need to implement this, whether that's a process or something clinical or education wise, or even just the way you communicate. Have you taken anything from those intercultural relationships that you've brought back with you and made part of your culture?
Yeah, I think the Danish folks actually typically, and this isn't true of everyone like any attribute would be, but right. Generally speaking, they're much more direct in their communication than perhaps we are here. Mm-hmm. So that's an adjustment you get used to. As it relates to EMS practice, for example, I would say if you look at Europe in general, how they use devices for patient movement, extrication, stretchers, I would say they're probably a little ahead of us in terms of some of the technology that they've employed to ensure safe movement of patients, not just for the patient, but also for the providers.
Sure.
Really, again, it runs the gamut, although most of the medical scenarios were actually kind of ACLS, if you will, based in terms of the criteria. But there's always those practices. And so what I've personally taken from it is to be able to say, hey, it's not just going to that conference. And Brett, you're right. It was an awesome experience for our team. Right. Glad I got to chaperone them, so to speak. But it was really eye-opening. And if anyone does have the opportunity to travel to that European EMS conference, I would highly recommend it, just for the experience, for all we're talking about today, just to be able to learn a different approach and understand, also to help you provide information to those folks in terms of what you're doing in your community and maybe some best practices, because we are one big EMS family, and that is an opportunity. But I would say it's not just that conference for me. That journey has been continually keeping that mind open to those practices, those processes, the way the folks communicate. What successes are they having as it relates to generational leadership? What successes are they having, not just on the clinical side or, again, the practical side of patient movements and that sort of thing, but really having that much broader resource, if you will, to learn from and to share with has really been, I would say, the most eye-opening and beneficial piece that I've experienced in my time with FEL.
Sure, and I imagine that it would be. So you go and you go with one mindset, and you come back with even just a little bit of a more open mind or an understanding. I think there's huge value in that. So I'm curious to know, when you're talking to your folks, so you run Colorado Rocky Mountain, and that's you're based out of Aurora, right?
Right. So
when you're in Colorado and you're leading meetings and you're having these discussions, it's interesting that you say that they are more direct, that the Danes are more direct, because typically Americans are known for being pretty direct. You know, when our cultural, and so I'm speaking from someone being from Texas, maybe maybe in the northern states or the Northeast, I love cultures. Let's just say that. So in the South, we have a lot of Latin influence and a lot of Hispanic culture, and they're not as direct as sometimes we as Americans are. But then you go Northeast, and they're more direct than we are as Southerners. And so I think those barriers and those people and how people communicate, really, we all heard it a million times, right? It's not what you say, it's how you say it. To get the message across is something that I'm really passionate about. So I'm curious, because I kind of played on words a little bit with the name of this recording, right? It's the emergent leadership. What does emergent leadership mean to you, David?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a great name. I think it's a great podcast title. For me, when I first heard the title, I was thinking about it being, as it relates to, of course, the play on the emergent of do, and then, of course, emerging leadership. I think a lot of that is really finding, the first thing I thought of really was thinking about that next generation of leaders in my profession, in our profession, and how do those folks really find those roles. And for me, it was a thought that, and when I talk to all of our new employee hire groups on their first day, one thing that it sounds so obvious, but I don't think it is necessarily all the time, and that is, some of these folks, have you ever aspired to be in leadership? Maybe it hasn't even been in the paradigm for them to consider that. In other cases, maybe they've wanted to do it but don't know how to go about doing it. So it's very simple, but I say, look, the first thing is, how do we help you in your career, and how do we help you achieve what your goals are? Whether it's in leadership, whether it's maybe not in EMS, maybe it's in healthcare, maybe it's the fire service, or maybe it is in EMS leadership. But you have to tell us. We're trying to do a lot of things as leaders, but we can't read minds, at least not yet. And so from those folks that say, you know what, I'm new at this, and I want to be a paramedic, and I want to work for a little while as a field medic, but I want to pursue a track on education. So how do we connect you and help you design that path on clinical leadership and education? Or the person says, I want to be in supervision and leadership. Well, how do we get you on that supervisory track and help you develop your career and be a part of that? But that first piece, as obvious as it sounds, is articulating and having that conversation and raising your hand and saying, this is what I want to do, and how can I get there, and how can you help me? So it seems really obvious. The second part of that, some folks look at me and say, well, I've never thought about leadership. That's someone else, right? And I would say, challenge yourself. maybe it's not, you have to want to love it. You have to have a passion for it. But at the same time, some folks have never even challenged themselves to consider, could I do that? And so to get that thought process going of saying, okay, yeah, I don't necessarily want to do it tomorrow, but if I start planting the seeds today for a leadership career, challenge yourself to consider that, yeah, you could do this. Just like when, I'll speak my own story. When I was an EMT, and paramedic school is not easy. And when I was in paramedic school, there were times you think, gosh, I'm going to give up, or I don't know if I can do this. And you say, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to challenge myself. I can get through this. I can do this. And I can see myself getting through and meeting that goal. It's the same, I think, with pursuing leadership roles, not only in our industry, but really in any organization or industry.
Right. Well, and you hit on two things. One, the self-awareness and the kind of personal introspection to say, what do I want out of my career as step one? But I also heard you say that you believe strongly in asking the question. I think a lot of times we put the onus on someone else, right? And so I really strongly believe, hey, if I don't take ownership of my career, who's going to? That said, it's nice to know that there are people out there like yourself who are inspiring and motivating that conversation to say, maybe you haven't thought about this. And I mean, EMS is a physically demanding career. And there are people who have, been on a truck. I mean, you probably don't know off the top of your head, but you've got people in your operation, I'm sure, who are, in their 40s, pushing, 50s, maybe even a little bit older, who just physically, you get to a point in your career where you go, okay, what's next? And I think when you have those conversations earlier in your career and you start opening your mind, the same as those intercultural conversations, to say, what are my options? What else is out there? What else can I do in this caregiving industry that I'm so passionate about? How can I continue to help people in maybe a different path? And so I think it's interesting, David, to hear you, having come from that traditional path, say that you're engaging in these conversations with people earlier in their career to ask the question, what do you want your path to look like? And so I'm curious to know, did someone sit down and do that with you? Did you have that strong mentor who said, let's line it out? Or was that something that you kind of figured out as you went?
Well, I think it's both. And, on that line, I would say also to be careful. I might say if you worked with us, Brett, you'd be a great supervisor. But if you don't want to be a supervisor, that's not a good combination either.
Right.
So it is helpful to know what your goals and aspirations are, so I can facilitate or try to help where I can in that, or Falk or your employer can help you with that. But for me, like most, I had some great mentors in my career. It was never really mapped out or a career, but I did think about, maybe this is where that advice comes from. I thought about, hey, this is what I want to do. And I set some goals professionally that I had. And then I articulated those goals. And I was fortunate to have mentors that saw potential and said, oh yeah, well then I'm going to provide that support. And to me, as cliche as it sounds, that's where you have to give back as well. Once you are able to achieve some of those leadership roles, it is not just optional. To me, it's an obligation. You have to extend that hand and say, how can I be that person that, was someone for me that mentored or offered that. To me, it's a little bit more blatant perhaps, and that folks, I think, have their own motivations. But to me, it's about, again, challenging that paradigm that they may have, that they've never either considered it, or they have the aspiration but haven't necessarily told anybody. And so it's very, very difficult to find that. And I would say the advice with that is, I mentioned the clinical path or the supervisory path, but really finding what is it, that thing that you really have a passion for doing. And most EMS providers have a passion for EMS. That's why they're in the field. There's maybe some other aspects to what that career provides. And so you help design that based on what your individual passions and strengths are. Because the bottom line is, if you like doing something and you have fun and it's rewarding, then it really comes a lot more naturally, I think, than if you're forced into something. Back to my example of drafting a supervisor. That never works. I mean, what has EMS typically done? We've taken the senior most person, who on the ambulance and say, hey, let's make him a supervisor. Well, arguably the skill sets of a paramedic and a skill set of a frontline supervisor, probably there's a Venn diagram, right? There's some overlap, but majority probably not. So we need to find those folks that have that passion for maybe serving others in that leadership role, and find those things.
Yeah, I had a really great conversation with another leader in the industry who shared similar kind of sentiment. Look, they're different skill sets, and so being a good clinician and being a great paramedic doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a great, in a leadership role. And frankly, vice versa. And we talked through a little bit of management versus leadership and those skill set differences. So I guess I love to hear you kind of speaking that same truth. I love to hear your passion. Clearly, people that work under you are privileged to be under your leadership. And so I appreciate that. It's nice to hear people that have that traditional career path. I myself am not a clinician. And I've always said I don't play one on TV. I don't pretend to be one. There's people who do that well, and I respect and appreciate them. But I think it's finding that passion, and sometimes that passion is leadership. Sometimes it's not. But to your point earlier, sometimes you don't know that it is until you get there, right? So I think there are times where, whether it's the best practice or not, people get put in leadership roles. So do you have any advice for those people as they're saying, all right, I'm a clinician, I'm a really, great paramedic, or I'm a really great EMT, and now I got to manage people, and that may not be my bag. Do you have any advice for how those people kind of transition, and how do they become stronger leaders if they don't necessarily recognize that in themselves quite yet?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, sometimes it is about that mentorship and finding someone who can help develop that skill, just as you would an instructor in a paramedic program who develops those clinical skills. In some cases, though, on that career path, I think the option might be to find, is there some sort of, I'll use the term apprenticeship, but that's probably more of in the trades world, not ours. But, in our case, for example, in our organization, we have cross-trained paramedics who fill in as supervisors. So if the full-time folks take their time off or need to fill in, so they're in a part-time role, but it gets you that toe in the water. Maybe you're not full-fledged in terms of having all of the skills you need, but you can manage a shift for a day, and you can be successful in solving problems. And that really, I think, gives you a taste of whether, is this something, when the phone is ringing every 30 seconds with a new fire to put out, figuratively speaking, and this issue is happening, and I got to respond to this call, and the multitasking that's required, you're going to probably know very quickly, is that reward there or not? The other thing I think in EMS leadership, and this isn't necessarily my original thought, but I think it's a really good one. Paramedics and EMTs, we're used to short-term gratification. So if I defibrillate someone and I get a viable rhythm, that's rewarding. If I administer D50 to a hypoglycemic patient and they wake up, that's rewarding. Mm-hmm. As we know, leadership doesn't necessarily have that same immediate, you get some immediate feedback, of course. Long-term journey for the reward side of that as a leader. And I think that paradigm shift is another big one that's really, really large for especially new and aspiring leaders. And so I think, but having a chance to find, that maybe that tryout role for yourself as well as organization is a great way to, again, dip that toe in the proverbial water and see if it's your thing.
Sure. No, that's great. And, some organizations do, they kind of pair people, and they are more intentional with even partners on a truck, right? How do they design what that looks like when they do a shift bid? Are they putting the most senior with the newer guys, and what that design is? And there's a lot of conversation around strategy there. Keeping it simple, it's just about, as I'm hearing you say, as an employee, as a leader, as a clinician, wherever you are, as a CEO of, Falcon Rocky Mountain, having that mindset of, I've got more to learn. There's more out there, and people know things that I don't know. And so having that mentality that you don't know everything. And I think especially in leadership really is not only integral, but it's critical that you have that mindset of what else is there, because you're going to get feedback, and it's not always going to be the right thing. And you didn't always make the decision that's the most popular, and some of those challenges that come with that. I think all come down to, are you open to that? Are you open, whether that's a constructive criticism, feedback, a process, a tough decision, or as much as to say, hey, I got this super direct communication from my boss's boss, and I don't know how to manage that communication style. Just having that mindset of openness, that there's other ways that things can be done in the world. There's more than one way to skin a cat. And that's what I'm hearing you say has been a big part of your leadership journey, is keeping that open mind to where your career goes, what kind of organization you're working for, how you communicate, how do you mentor, how you reach people. So pretty powerful.
I think being honest, as a new leader, you're going to make mistakes, just as you are as a new paramedic or a new EMT. And I think what I challenge the folks in those roles, if you had a rationale behind what your decision making was, and to your point, Brett, it's a great one. There's a lot of ways to get to that end goal, and maybe your choice of how to get there is different than mine. And as long as it's ethical and moral and honest, then that's okay. It's a matter of making sure you had that rationale behind your thought, and then you're accountable. And then if you say, hey, you know what, I would have done it differently, or your way was perhaps better than mine, or hey, think about this approach because it might have been a different way that would have, gotten you there much quicker or easier, right, and that sort of thing. But you make a great point that, of course, there's lots of ways to solve problems, and that's the other piece that's really important, back to that analogy of the paramedic giving the D50 and the patient waking up. Protocols and clinical treatment and EMS, yeah, there's different pathways you can go down, but typically it's a much more narrow path because, hey, I've got a patient in cardiac arrest. I know the check things I have to do.
Right.
The frustrating thing for new leaders in this field after having served in that EMT and paramedic role is that there's really no checkbox.
Right.
Yeah, there's some tenets, there's foundations of effective leadership and those things we've talked about being honest and having, put thought behind your decision making. But at the same time, it's so much more gray than that kind of, steps I need to take to resuscitate this patient. And that can really, really frustrate leaders. And so the similarity though is the trial and error. You do continue and you have more experience at different problem solving situations, and you hone that skill and you're better at it. And that's true again as a new paramedic or as a new leader.
Right. No, great points. David, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me today. As I said, I think that the EMS world, the industry, healthcare in general, is full of people with a story similar to yours in the career progression. But having that new piece is something I think that you bring something really special to the industry. And I hope that you use your voice as a platform to be able to, to spread that message, right? That there's not just one way. And I think that Falck in general is well positioned, as is, dare I say, GMR or some of the other international powers that have seen the way people do things differently. I think the most powerful thing that I could leave our audience with, and I appreciate you guys listening, is that the thing that you've said, there's more than one way. And it's this mindset of accept, trial and error. And I love that you close us out with that. David, thank you for being with us today. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you got as much of this out of this as I did, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Emergent Leadership.